History records that humanity answered the SOS when no one else would. What history does not record is how close the galaxy came to dying alone. I've spent 20 years giving interviews about the events at the Cradle of Echoes. I've recited the casualty figures, the fleet movements, and the verified transmissions so many times that I could repeat them in my sleep. The official record is complete, accurate, and thoroughly documented. It is also missing the most important part. No journalist ever asked what it felt like. What it felt like to stand before an observation window and watch the last hope of an entire civilization arrive, not as a mighty armada, but as 14 battered human ships, held together by scorch marks, emergency repairs, and sheer stubbornness. I remember staring at them in disbelief, because beyond those 14 vessels waited a force large enough to erase worlds, and those humans knew it. They came anyway. That was the moment I realized the galaxy had misunderstood humanity from the very beginning. I wept not from fear, though there was fear enough to shatter every bone in my body. I wept from shame, because when the end came for over 1 million souls, my people did nothing. The Sovereign Concord did nothing. The Rith Dominion, the Ilwari Consortium, the 1,000 gilded civilizations that called themselves the light of the galaxy. They all heard us screaming, and every single one of them looked the other way. The only ones who answered were the ones we had spent centuries calling savages. My name is Keth Vorin. I am a Veltari archivist, or I was before the events I am about to describe turned me into something I never expected to become. My species has kept the records of the galaxy for 11,000 years. We are careful, precise, and above all, we are observers. We do not act, we do not fight, we watch, and we write things down. That is what we are good at. That is all I thought I would ever be good at. I was stationed aboard the Cradle of Echo, a neutral zone space station the size of a small moon, sitting on the edge of the Orion Corridor. The Cradle was built 3 centuries ago as a diplomatic waypoint and refugee hub, a place where ships could dock, where displaced populations could find temporary shelter, where species that did not trust each other could meet on neutral ground. It was designed to hold 400,000 beings. On the day I sent the first entry of this record, it held 1.2 million. They came in waves, colony ships packed so tight the air recyclers could barely keep up, military transports with their weapons ripped off, and their cargo bays converted into sleeping quarters, civilian yachts, trading vessels, mining barges, anything that could fly and carry people. They came from every corner of the Orion Corridor, and they all carried the same look in their eyes. That hollow, shattered expression that comes from watching your home disappear behind you and knowing it will not be there when you look back again. The hollow tide had taken everything. I need to explain what the hollow tide was, because if you have not seen it, you cannot understand the kind of fear it puts into a living soul. It was not a fleet. It was not an army. It was a swarm. A moving wall of self-replicating machines, each one a jagged angular thing the color of dead iron. Roughly the size of a small shuttle, but capable of tearing apart a warship in minutes. They consumed everything they touched, metal, energy, organic matter, and used it to build more of themselves. They did not communicate. They did not negotiate. They did not slow down. They moved through space like a disease, and everything behind them was silence. No one knew where they came from. Our best scientists believed they were the remnants of some ancient civilization's final weapon, something built millions of years ago by a species long dead, left drifting in dark space until something woke them up. It did not matter. What mattered was that they were eating the Orion Corridor alive, system by system, and they were heading straight for us. Station Commander Yalari, a decorated Rye Admiral with silver-blue scales and a voice like cracking ice, stood on the command deck and broadcast the SOS herself. She invoked the Accord of Mutual Salvation, the oldest and most sacred treaty in galactic law, the one that says if any signatory species faces extinction-level danger, every other signatory is obligated to respond. Not requested, obligated. It is the one law that was supposed to be unbreakable. I stood behind her and recorded the transmission. I recorded every response that came back, and I will carry the memory of those responses to whatever waits beyond the end of my life. The Rith Dominion, Yandari's own people, responded first. They expressed their deep concern. They were repositioning their defensive assets to protect core systems, translation, They were pulling their fleets back and abandoning the corridor. They wished us strength in this difficult time. The Ilwari Consortium sent a formally worded message of sympathy. They attached a cultural file on grief processing techniques used by 12 different species. They did not send ships. My own people, the Veltari arch of them, sent me a direct order. Secure the cultural records. Prepare the data cores for emergency transfer. Begin legacy preservation protocols. Legacy preservation. They were telling me to save the files, not the people. One by one, they all said no. The Dranathi Federation said their fleet was committed elsewhere. The Olsen Republic said the corridor was outside their jurisdiction. The Sovereign Concord itself, the governing body of the galaxy, the institution that wrote the Accord of Mutual Salvation into law, declared the Orion Corridor a strategic loss zone and redirected every available defense fleet to protect the inner systems. They wrote off 1.22 million lives with a single vote. I recorded each refusal. I time-stamped them. I filed them with the professional precision that my training demanded. My hands did not shake. My voice did not crack. I was an archivist. This is what we do. We record. But inside, something was breaking. 41 hours after the SOS. With the hollow tide now visible on our long-range sensors as a dark smear, eating the stars on the edge of the corridor, a signal came in. Our communications officer almost missed it, because it arrived on a frequency so old and so crude that the system nearly filtered it out as background noise. Radio frequency. Actual electromagnetic radio waves. The kind of communication technology that most species abandon within a few centuries of achieving spaceflight. A voice came through, rough and unpolished, speaking galactic common, with a thick accent that our translation system struggled to smooth out. Station Cradle of Echoes. This is Captain Raya Vasquez of the Terran Expeditionary Fleet. We picked up your signal. We are coming. How many do you need us to save? Not can we help. Not what is the situation. Not let us consult with our government. How many do you need us to save? As if the decision to come had already been made the moment they heard the call, and the only remaining question was logistics, the command deck went quiet. Yandari stared at the communications console for a long moment. I watched her expression shift through surprise, confusion, and then something I recognized with a cold shock. It was disdain. She looked at me and said, "The humans." She said it the way you might say the word vermin if you found them in your food stores. Not with alarm, with tired annoyance. I knew almost nothing about humans at that point. My species had been keeping records on every known civilization for millennia, and our file on humanity was 4 lines long. Species classification category 12, ascendant primitive, cultural status savage, threat level low. Notes: emotional, aggressive, fragile, not yet suited for galactic participation. 4 lines. That was all we had thought they were worth. Yandari opened a channel and responded to the human captain with the bare minimum of diplomatic courtesy. She acknowledged the signal, provided the station's coordinates, and suggested that the Terran ships might assist with evacuating non-essential personnel to the nearest Accord-controlled system. She did not say thank you. She did not ask how many ships they were bringing. She assumed, as we all did, that this was a token gesture. A few small ships, perhaps carrying humanitarian supplies, something the humans were doing to make themselves feel important. We were wrong about so many things, but we were never more wrong than we were about that. I pulled up everything in the Veltari archives about humanity. It took me less than a minute to read it all. They were a young species barely 3 centuries into spaceflight, originating from a single small planet in an unremarkable solar system. They had been contacted by the Rai roughly 150 years ago and offered provisional membership in the Galactic Accord, which they had accepted with what the Rai diplomatic file described as inappropriate enthusiasm. They had been given access to basic faster-than-light technology, which they had immediately begun modifying in ways that made Rith engineers nervous. They had been involved in several minor border disputes with neighboring species, all of which they had resolved through a combination of aggressive negotiation and what one Ilwari diplomat described as an unsettling willingness to escalate. They had applied for full membership in the Sovereign Concord 4 times. They had been denied 4 times. The reasons varied, but they all came down to the same thing. Humanity was too emotional, too aggressive, too unpredictable. They had not yet demonstrated the maturity required for full participation in galactic civilization. They were, in the polite language of Concord bureaucracy, a developing species. In the less polite language used in the corridors and meeting rooms, where real decisions were made, they were savages. I closed the file and looked at the sensor display, where the hollow tide was growing larger with every passing hour. I looked at the communication logs where 23 civilized species had told us they were sorry, but they could not help. And I looked at the single blinking light on the console that represented the incoming human fleet. I made a note in my personal log. I am not proud of what I wrote, but I have promised to tell the truth. And so I will tell you. I wrote, "The humans have responded. Goddess, help us." I did not know then what I know now. I did not know that those words would become the most shameful thing I have ever committed to record. I did not know that within 3 days I would watch those so-called savages do something that no civilized species in the history of the galaxy had ever done. I did not know that they would teach me what courage actually looks like. But I am getting ahead of myself. The humans had not arrived yet. They were still out there in the dark, flying toward us at speeds that should not have been possible in the junk heap ships we assumed they were flying. And the hollow tide was getting closer, a wall of dead metal and endless hunger, blotting out the stars one by one. On the station, the refugees were packed into every available space. Families slept in corridors. Children cried in languages I did not speak. The air recyclers groaned under the strain. The medical bays were overflowing. Food supplies were rationed, and arguments broke out at distribution points between species that blamed each other for the crisis, as though blame could feed anyone. I moved through it all with my recording equipment, documenting everything, because that was all I knew how to do. I told myself it was important work. I told myself that even if the station fell, the records would survive, transmitted to the deep space archives, where the Veltari kept backups of everything that ever mattered. I told myself that someone someday would read my account and understand what happened here. But the truth is that I was hiding. I was hiding behind my work, behind my role, behind the comfortable lie that observing suffering was the same as doing something about it. It is a lie my entire species had been telling itself for 11,000 years, and I believed it completely. I believed it right up until the moment a human woman with a mechanical eye and scarred hands stepped onto my station and made me realize I had never actually understood a single thing about bravery. That was still hours away. For now, there was only the waiting, the slow crawl of time that happens when you know something terrible is coming and you cannot stop it. I stood at the observation window on Deck 17 and watched the stars. Somewhere out there, behind the faint shimmer of the approaching tide, was the human fleet coming toward us, flying into the worst thing the galaxy had ever produced. I could not understand why. Every species I knew operated on the same basic principle. You protect your own. You calculate the risks. You weigh the costs. If the numbers say you cannot win, you do not fight. This is not cowardice. This is intelligence. This is what separates civilized beings from animals. You do not throw yourself into the fire just because someone you have never met is burning. That is what I believed. That is what every civilized species in the galaxy believed. The humans apparently had not received that particular lesson. 17 hours after the first signal, the Terran Expeditionary Fleet dropped out of faster-than-light travel at the edge of our sensor range, and I got my first look at the species that was going to change everything. I remember standing at the observation deck, surrounded by a dozen other station residents who had come to see the human fleet arrive. There was a Rith diplomat, 2 Ilwari merchants, a handful of Dranathi refugees, and an old Olan engineer who had been on the station for 20 years, and claimed he had seen everything worth seeing in the galaxy. We all stood there staring at the sensor display, waiting for the gleaming warships and elegant formations that we associated with real military power. What we saw instead made the Olan engineer sit down very slowly, as if his legs had stopped working. There were 14 ships, 14 against a swarm of tens of thousands, and they were the ugliest, most battered, most frankly terrifying collection of vessels I had ever seen in my 11 years of service. There were no gleaming hulls. There were no elegant curves. What came out of faster-than-light travel was a ragged pack of ships that looked like they had been built in a junkyard by people who did not know the meaning of the word surrender and had never once cared about the meaning of the word beautiful. 3 of them were old colony transports, massive, slow-moving things with thick hulls that had been welded over with additional armor plating until they looked like flying boulders. 2 were repurposed mining vessels, their industrial cutting beams re-angled to serve as weapons, their hulls scorched from years of asteroid work. 5 were frigates, small and fast and mean-looking, with oversized engines that seemed to make up half the ship, and weapons arrays that bristled from every surface like the spines of some deep ocean predator. 2 were support ships, tankers, and supply carriers, riding low and heavy. 1 was a ship I could not even classify, a strange hybrid thing that looked like 3 different ships welded together. And then there was the Guadalcanal. The Guadalcanal was their only true warship, a heavy cruiser that sat at the center of the formation like a scarred wolf at the head of its pack. She was not pretty. She was not elegant. She was covered in scorch marks and hull patches from what had clearly been a long and violent career. Her name was painted on her side in white letters that were chipped and faded. And below the name, someone had painted a row of small symbols that I later learned represented every engagement she had survived. There were a lot of symbols. The Rife diplomat standing next to me said quietly, "That is their fleet." The ocean engineer, still sitting on the floor, said nothing. He was staring at the ships with an expression I could not read. It was not contempt. It was not pity. It was something older and more complicated, and I did not understand it until much later. It was recognition. He had seen ships like that before. Not these ships specifically, but this kind of ship. Ships built by people who could not afford perfection and did not care about it anyway. Ships built by people who intended to use them hard and expected them to survive the experience or die trying. Ships that were not designed to impress anyone. Ships that were designed to fight. Captain Vasquez sent ahead a docking request, and when the station's automated systems flagged her fleet as unregistered with the Sovereign Concord, she responded with a single sentence that I will remember for the rest of my life. "We are not here for your paperwork. We are here for your people. Open the dock." Commander Yandari, to her credit, did not argue. She opened the dock, and for the first time in the history of the Cradle of Echoes, humans set foot on a galactic station, and everything I thought I knew about the universe began to come apart. Captain Raya Vasquez came aboard with a team of 6. I was assigned as the official Veltari liaison, which in practice meant I was supposed to follow the humans around, record their activities, and report anything concerning to the station command. I expected brutes. The archive said savage, and I expected savage. I expected towering warriors with dull eyes and loud voices. Beings driven by instinct rather than reason. Dangerous, in the way that natural disasters are dangerous. Powerful, but mindless. What walked through the airlock was a woman, roughly 2/3 my height, with dark brown skin, close-cropped black hair, and one eye replaced by a mechanical implant that glowed a faint amber. She wore a uniform that had been patched and repatched so many times it was more repair than original fabric. Her hands were thick with calluses and marked with scars, the hands of someone who had spent a lifetime building and breaking things with equal skill. She moved through the corridor, with an economy of motion that I initially mistook for clumsiness, but quickly realized was something else entirely. Every step was deliberate. Every glance measured distance and angle. She moved like a creature that had learned to fight in spaces where there was no room for wasted movement. She looked at me, and I felt a strange jolt, like a static charge passing between us. Her good eye was dark and warm and utterly unreadable. Her mechanical eye whirred softly as it focused on my face. "You are the archivist," she said. It was not a question. "I am Keferin of the Veltari Archive," I said, drawing myself up to my full height. "I have been assigned as your liaison during your stay aboard the station." She looked at me for another moment. Then she said, "Good. Stay close. I want someone writing this down." I did not understand why at the time. I assumed it was vanity. I was wrong about that too. Commander Yalari received Vasquez in the command center with a formality that bordered on coldness. She thanked the humans for their response to the SOS. She provided a tactical briefing on the Hollow Tides approach. She estimated they had less than 16 hours before the swarm reached the station. And then, with the careful diplomatic phrasing that the Reth use when they want to say something insulting without technically being rude, she suggested that the human fleet might best serve by assisting with the evacuation of non-essential personnel to a safe system. Vasquez listened to all of it. She stood perfectly still, her arms at her sides, her face expressionless. When Yandari finished, Vasquez said, "Commander, how many of your people have you evacuated so far?" Yandari blinked. "Evacuation is not currently possible. The nearest safe system is 4 days away at standard speeds, and we do not have enough transport capacity to move 1.2 million beings in the time remaining. So when you say evacuation," Vasquez said, "what you mean is that you want us to take as many as we can carry and leave the rest behind." The command center went very quiet. "That is the practical reality." "Yes," Yandari said, and for the first time, I heard something crack in her voice. She was a proud woman, a career officer who had spent her life in service to the Wrath fleet. Admitting that she could not save her own station was costing her something I could see even through her rigid composure. Vasquez nodded slowly. Then she said 5 words that changed the direction of the next 3 days, and I would argue the next 3 centuries of galactic history. "We did not come to run." Yandari stared at her. Several of the station's senior officers exchanged looks. I saw confusion, disbelief, and in a few faces, the first faint stirring of something that might have been hope. "Captain Vasquez," Yandari said carefully, "you have 14 ships, the hollow-tide numbers in the tens of thousands. With respect, what exactly do you propose to do?" Vasquez reached into her jacket and pulled out a data chip. She set it on the command table. "I propose to fight. This is our tactical plan. My people have been working on it since we picked up your signal. It is not perfect. It is not safe, but it gives this station a chance, and a chance is more than anyone else has offered you." She looked around the command center, meeting the eyes of every officer present, human and alien alike. "Every species in this galaxy heard your SOS and did the math. They decided you were not worth the cost. We heard the same signal. We did the same math. We just did not care about the math. Because where we come from, you do not leave people behind. Not ever. Nobody spoke for a long time. I remember thinking, standing there in that command center with my recording equipment running, and my 4 hands gripping the edge of my console, that I was witnessing either the bravest or the most foolish thing I had ever seen. I could not tell which. I am still not entirely sure I know the difference. While the command staff reviewed the human battle plan, Vasquez's crew spread across the station. Dozens of humans came aboard from the fleet, carrying tools, medical supplies, spare parts, and a kind of restless energy that seemed to fill every corridor they walked through. They moved fast, talked loud, and got to work with a speed that left the station's existing crews scrambling to keep up. I was assigned to shadow a group of them, and what I observed over the next several hours dismantled every assumption I had ever held about humanity. The first human I spent significant time with was Danny Park, a ship's engineer from the colony transport, Stellan Maru. He was of medium height, lean and wiry, with short dark hair, and a smile that seemed to show up at entirely inappropriate moments. He spoke Galactic Common with a musical accent, and had a habit of humming while he worked. The station's atmospheric recycling system on Deck 9 had been failing for 2 days. The Veltari maintenance team had declared it beyond field repair, and recommended sealing the deck and relocating its 6,000 residents to already overcrowded sections. Danny Park walked into the recycler room, looked at the machine, asked 2 questions about its design specifications, and then spent the next 9 hours inside it, rebuilding components by hand, with tools he had brought from his own ship. I watched him work. He talked the entire time, not to me specifically, but to anyone within earshot. He talked about his ship, about his crew, about a restaurant back on Earth that made something called foo, that he said was worth crossing a galaxy for. He talked about his daughter, a little girl named Lily, who was 7 years old, and believed that her father drove a cargo transport. "She thinks I deliver packages," he said, grinning inside the guts of the recycler. I did not have the heart to tell her that the packages sometimes try to shoot at me. A Voltari child wandered into the recycler room at some point, drawn by the noise and light. She was maybe 5 years old, with the translucent blue skin and enormous dark eyes of our species. She stood in the doorway and stared at Danny with open fascination. He noticed her, smiled, and held up a tool, a simple metal wrench. "You want to help?" he asked. She did not speak Galactic Common, but she understood the gesture. She walked over, took the wrench in 2 of her 4 small hands, and Danny showed her how to tighten a bolt. They worked together for 20 minutes, the human and the alien child. And when Danny finished the repair, and the recycler hummed back to life, he knelt down and gave her the wrench. "Keep it," he said. "Every good engineer needs her own wrench." She took it and ran off, clutching it like a treasure. I watched her go, and I felt something shift inside my chest, a feeling I did not have a word for in my language. In the medical bay on Deck 4, I encountered another human, a combat medic named Sergeant Ada Obi. She was tall and broad-shouldered, with dark skin and close-cropped hair, and she moved through the overcrowded medical bay with a calm authority that made the station's own medical staff step aside without being asked. The medical bay was struggling. The station's medical systems were designed for the common physiologies of the Accord species, and the refugee population included beings from a dozen different worlds with wildly different biological needs. The existing staff was overwhelmed and had been prioritizing patients by species compatibility, which in practice meant that several alien species with unusual biologies were not receiving treatment at all. ADS did not prioritize by species. She treated everyone. When she encountered a biology she did not recognize, she asked questions, consulted the station's medical database, and improvised. I watched her set a broken limb on a drothy child, using a splint she fashioned from packing material and medical tape. I watched her diagnose a respiratory infection in an Olean elder by listening to his breathing with a device she pressed against his chest. I watched her sit with a dying Ilwari, an old male whose injuries were beyond treatment, and hold his seven-fingered hand while he slipped away. She hummed a quiet melody, something from Earth, and she stayed until the end. When it was over, she stepped into a supply closet and cried for 3 minutes. Then she washed her face, walked back into the medical bay, and went to her next patient. I did not know what to do with any of this. It did not fit the categories I had been given. These were supposed to be savages, aggressive and emotional, and unsuited for galactic civilization. And they were aggressive. I saw that. And they were emotional. I saw that too. But the aggression was directed at problems, not people. And the emotion was not weakness. It was fuel. It was the thing that kept Danny Park humming inside a broken machine for 9 hours, and a Diobi holding a stranger's hand as he passed from one existence to whatever comes next. In the corridor outside the medical bay, I witnessed something that confused me even further. 2 human Marines, large men with close-cut hair and thick arms, got into a fight, an actual fight, with fists and shouting over a card game that had apparently gone wrong. Other humans pulled them apart. There was yelling. One of them had a cut above his eye. 20 minutes later, I walked past the same corridor and found the same 2 men sitting against the wall, sharing a container of something they were drinking, and laughing as if nothing had happened. The one with the cut was showing the other a photograph on a small device, and they were both grinning. I stared at them. They noticed me staring. The one with the cut waved and said, "You good, tall guy?" I did not know how to answer that question. I was not good. I was lost. Everything I thought I understood about these beings was dissolving like vapor in starlight, and what was emerging underneath was something far stranger and far more magnificent than anything in my archives. I went back to my quarters and sat in the dark for a long time. Then I opened my personal log and wrote something that I meant with every fiber of my being, even though I did not yet understand the full weight of it. They are not what I expected. They are worse. They are more. I do not have a category for them. That night, the command staff gathered to review the human battle plan in detail. Vasquez presented it alongside 2 of her officers, a tall, quiet man named Neil Grady, who served as her tactical advisor, and a young woman named Lucy Harmon, who was her chief pilot, and who smiled far too much for someone about to fly into a swarm of extinction machines. The plan was, by every standard of galactic military doctrine, completely and utterly out of its mind. The Accord approach to military engagement, shared by every spacefaring species I knew of, was built on caution, calculation, and the preservation of assets. You engaged from maximum range. You used precision strikes. You avoided close combat. You never, under any circumstances, threw your ships into a fight where you were outnumbered 1,000 to 1. These were not suggestions. These were the foundational principles of civilized warfare, developed over millennia by species that understood the mathematics of survival. The humans proposed the exact opposite. Their plan called for direct engagement at close range. They intended to use the asteroid fields surrounding the station as a maze of cover and ambush points, luring hollow tide units into channels where pre-placed mining charges could shatter them. The frigates would operate in pairs using a technique they called knife fighting, which involved getting so close to enemy units that the TID's coordination systems could not effectively target them. The colony transports, slow but incredibly tough with their welded-on armor, would serve as mobile barriers, absorbing damage and blocking the tide's advance through key approach vectors. And the Guadalcanal would hold the center, drawing fire, dealing damage, and refusing to move. The plan relied on speed, aggression, human reflexes, and something Vasquez called acceptable losses, a phrase that made Commander Yandari physically recoil. "You are proposing to sacrifice your own ships," Yandari said. "I am proposing to put my ships between your station and the things trying to eat it," Vasquez replied. "What happens after that is up to us and them. The mathematics do not support this plan, Captain. The mathematics say everyone on this station is already gone, Commander. Every civilized species in the galaxy ran those numbers and decided to let you go. We are not here because the math works. We are here because 1,000,000 people are going to be consumed by machines if somebody does not stand in the way, and we are the only somebody who showed up." The room was silent. Yandari stared at her for a long time. Then she said very quietly, "Why?" Vasquez did not hesitate. "Because where we come from, you answer when someone calls for help. That is it. That is the whole reason." Yandari looked at her officers. She looked at me. She looked back at Vasquez. And then she did something I had never seen a Ray commander do. She inclined her head, a deep, formal bow of respect. "Then we will do everything in our power to support your fleet, Captain," she said. "Tell us what you need." What followed was 12 hours of the most intense preparation I have ever witnessed. The humans worked alongside the station crew, and I do not mean they supervised or directed. They worked with their hands. They hauled equipment, rewired systems, reprogrammed defense turrets, and deployed mining charges in the asteroid field, using shuttles that they flew with a reckless confidence that made the station's own pilots stare in open-mouthed disbelief. I followed Danny Park and his engineering team as they moved through the asteroid field in a battered shuttle, placing shaped charges with mathematical precision in locations they had calculated based on the tide's projected approach vectors. Danny explained the logic to me as we flew casually and cheerfully, as though we were not strapping high-yield detonators to rocks, while an extinction-level threat bore down on us. "The tide moves in a pattern," he said. "Not a smart pattern, more like a herd. They follow the path of least resistance, right? So we create paths of least resistance that lead exactly where we want them to go, and then we blow those paths apart. It is like setting traps for a river. You do not stop the water, you just make it flow where you want. This is mining technique," I said. He grinned. "Of course it is. We have been blowing up rocks for resources since before we figured out which end of the spaceship was the front. You fight with what you know." In the final hours, a strange calm settled over the station. The preparation was done. The charges were set. The ships were in position. There was nothing left to do but wait. I found Danny Park in a cargo bay, on the Stellan Maru painting, something on the side of a shuttle with a small brush and a can of white paint. It was a cartoon, a round, fluffy animal with floppy ears and a bright expression. "A dog," he told me. "A specific dog. That is Biscuit," he said. "My daughter Lily drew him. He is her imaginary dog. She told me that if I painted Biscuit on my shuttle, he would protect me." He finished a final detail on the cartoon, a small curving tail, and stepped back to look at his work. I promised her I would. "Does it help?" I asked. "Believing that a painting can protect you." He looked at me with an expression that was gentle and sad, and completely without self-pity. "It helps Lily," he said, "and that is what matters." I stood there in the cargo bay looking at the cartoon dog painted in white on the gray hull of a shuttle, and I understood something for the first time. Danny Park knew the odds. He was an engineer. He could do math better than most beings I had ever met. He knew that 14 ships against tens of thousands was not a fight anyone was expected to survive. He knew that the plan, for all its cleverness, was built on a foundation of hope rather than certainty. He knew all of this, and he had come anyway, not because he was too foolish to understand the danger, but because his daughter had asked him to paint a dog on his shuttle, and he was the kind of man who kept his promises. I found Vasquez alone in the station's arboretum, a section of Deck 12 that had once been a small garden, but had been converted to storage during the refugee crisis. The plants were gone, replaced by crates and supplies, but one tree remained in the center of the space. A tall, thin thing, with pale leaves that had turned brown and brittle from neglect. She sat on a crate beneath it, staring up at the dead branches. I approached carefully. She did not look at me, but she knew I was there. "Your species keeps records of everything," she said. "Do you have records of a planet called Earth?" "Some," I said. "Your homeworld, blue and green, third from a yellow star." "Blue and green," she repeated. "It was not always that way. We almost ended it. You know our world. We choked the air with poison, heated the oceans until the coastlines drowned, cut down the forests, and replaced them with concrete. We fought each other over territory, over resources, over ideas, over nothing at all. We came within a hair's breadth of making ourselves extinct. But you survived," I said. She looked at me then, and her good eye held something I had never seen before in any being of any species. It was not hope. It was not determination. It was something fiercer and more primal, a stubborn, burning refusal to accept the end of things. "We survived ourselves," she said. "That is the hardest thing any species will ever do. Everything else, swarms, machines, the empty dark between the stars, that is just a matter of stubbornness." A soft chime sounded through the station. Long-range sensors had updated. The hollow tide was now 12 hours away. I went to the deepest shelter on the station, Deck 22, where the children had been gathered. There were hundreds of them from half a dozen species, huddled together in a space designed for cargo. They were scared. Their parents had told them it would be all right, but children know when adults are lying. The fear in that room was thick enough to taste. A group of human Marines had been assigned to guard the shelter. Among them was a massive man named Kofi Mensa, easily the largest human I had ever seen, with arms like engine pistons and a voice so deep it seemed to come from somewhere underground. He sat cross-legged on the floor in the middle of a circle of alien children, and he was teaching them a game. It was a clapping game, the kind human children play. Simple rhythms, hand patterns, a melody chanted in a language none of the alien children understood. But they were learning it, their small hands and paws and tentacles clapping in rough time with Kofi's enormous palms. And they were laughing, laughing. In the deepest shelter of a doomed station with extinction 12 hours away, alien children were laughing because a human man the size of a cargo loader was teaching them to clap and sing. I stood in the doorway and listened to that sound, and I felt the last wall inside me crack. Not break, not crumble, just crack. A single fault line running through 11,000 years of Veltari certainty, through all the careful categories and classifications, and the quiet arrogance of a species that believed it understood the galaxy because it had been watching long enough. We did not understand anything. We understood facts. We understood data. We understood the precise orbital mechanics of 1,000 star systems and the diplomatic protocols of every spacefaring civilization. But we did not understand the thing that made a man teach alien children a clapping game 12 hours before the end of the world. We did not have a word for it. We did not have a category, the humans did. They called it love. And it was that, more than the ships, more than the weapons, more than the battle plan, that frightened me the most about them. Because love, the kind of love that makes you fly across 400 light-years to save strangers, the kind of love that makes you paint a cartoon dog on your shuttle and teach clapping games in bomb shelters, that kind of love is not rational. It does not calculate. It does not weigh costs and benefits. It simply is as vast and relentless and unstoppable as the hollow tide itself. And it was coming toward the tide at full speed in 14 battered ships, crewed by a species the galaxy called Savage. The hollow tide arrived early. It came out of the dark like a closing fist, filling the sensors from edge to edge, blotting out the starfield like someone had drawn a curtain across the universe. From the observation deck, I could see it with my own eyes, a vast glittering darkness that moved with a sickening organic ripple. Tens of thousands of jagged angular machines flowing together in a wave that had no beginning and no end. Each unit was a nightmare of sharp edges and dead metal, roughly the size of a shuttle. And together they formed something that was not a fleet or an army, but a hunger, a living, moving, infinite hunger. The station's defense turrets opened fire. Energy beams lanced out into the dark, striking the leading edge of the tide. Each beam hit a machine, and each machine shattered, and it did not matter at all. It was like throwing stones at an ocean. The tide absorbed the damage, flowed around the gaps and kept coming. And then the humans moved. 14 ships launched from the station perimeter and flew directly at the hollow tide. Not in a defensive formation, not in a cautious probing advance. They charged. Engines at maximum burn, weapons hot, heading straight into the heart of the swarm at speeds that the station's navigation officers later told me should have torn those ships apart. I pressed my face against the observation window and watched them go, and I felt my heart stop, both of them, for a full second. I was as close to death as I have ever been while still breathing, because it was the most terrifying and the most beautiful thing I had ever seen in my life. The frigates led the charge in pairs, screaming through the outer edge of the tide and firing at point-blank range, so close that the detonations lit up their own hulls. Lucy Harmon's frigate, the Knife's Edge, was the first through, and she flew that ship like it was part of her body, weaving between tide units at speeds that should have been impossible. Her weapons tearing through the machines with a precision that bordered on artistry. Behind her, the other frigates followed, each pair covering the other, spinning and diving and striking with a ferocity that left the tide's outer ranks in fragments. Then the mining charges went off. Danny Park had placed them perfectly, as the tide flowed through the asteroid field, following the paths of least resistance, exactly as he had predicted. The charges detonated in sequence, turning the debris channels into cascading walls of shrapnel that tore through hundreds of machines at once. The asteroid field became a labyrinth of fire and broken metal, and the tide, for the first time, faltered. The colony transports moved into the gaps, their massive armored hulls absorbing impacts that would have shattered any other vessel, positioning themselves as barriers in the corridors between the asteroids. The tide slammed against them and broke, flowing around them like water around boulders. And in those moments of disruption, the frigate struck again, hitting the confused and scattered machines from the sides, and the Guadalcanal held the center. I do not know how to describe what the Guadalcanal did without making it sound impossible, because it was impossible. She sat at the heart of the human formation, and she drew the tide onto herself like a wound drawing infection. Thousands of machines converged on her, battering her hull, tearing at her armor, and she absorbed it all. Her weapons fired in continuous rotation, each turret speaking in turn, pouring energy into the swarm in an endless roar. I could hear the battle through the station's hull, a deep vibration that I felt in my bones, and I realized it was the Guadalcanal's main guns firing so fast that the individual shots blurred into a single continuous thunder. Her hull was burning. Sections were open to the void. Atmosphere was venting from a dozen breaches, and she did not retreat. She did not slow down. She sat there in the middle of the swarm, and she fought and fought and fought, and the tide could not bring her down. On the station, we monitored the battle through every sensor we had. The communication channels were open, and I could hear the human crews talking to each other. Their voices were raw with adrenaline, and laced with a dark humor that I did not understand at first, but came to recognize as something essential to their nature. A pilot whose ship had lost a stabilizer joked that she could finally do the spin move she had been practicing. An engineer on one of the colony transports reported that they were holding steady, then added that the tide was welcome to keep trying because the hull was not going anywhere, and neither were they. A gunner on the Guadalcanal, firing into a mass of machines so dense he could not miss, muttered that this was the first time his accuracy score was going to be perfect. They were laughing. Some of them were laughing. In the middle of the worst battle any of them would ever fight, surrounded by machines built for nothing but destruction, they found moments to laugh. It defied everything I knew about combat, about survival, about the rational response to mortal danger. Keith Voren, the archivist, the observer, the being who had spent his entire life keeping a safe distance from the things he recorded, stood at that observation window and could not look away. I was shaking. My forehands gripped the railing so hard that my glass bones ached, and I was not shaking from fear. I was shaking because I had never in my life seen anything so alive. For one shining hour, the impossible plan worked. The tide's advance was halted. Its front line was shattered. The asteroid field was a graveyard of broken machines, and the human fleet moved through the wreckage like predators through a wounded herd, striking and retreating, and striking again. The kill count climbed into the thousands. The tide was thinning. Commander Yalari, watching from the command center, said something I never thought I would hear from a Reth officer. She said, "They might actually hold." Then the tide adapted. It happened fast, faster than any of our tactical models had predicted. The machines were not just mindless drones. Whatever ancient intelligence controlled them was watching, learning, adjusting. The tide units began to reconfigure themselves in real time, closing the blind spots that the frigates had been exploiting, reinforcing the approaches that the mining charges had blocked, absorbing debris instead of being shattered by it. The channels through the asteroid field that had been choke points of death became corridors of free movement as the machines learned to dismantle the obstacles. The swarm began to encircle the human fleet. 3 human ships were lost in rapid succession. A frigate, caught in a pincer movement, overwhelmed before its partner could reach it. A mining vessel whose improvised weapons overheated at the worst possible moment, leaving it defenseless for the 30 seconds it took the tide to tear it apart. A colony transport that held its position a fraction of a second too long and was swarmed from below. The Guadalcanal lost her main engine. One of the remaining frigates took a hit that crippled her navigation systems, sending her spinning into an asteroid at a speed that crumpled her bow like paper. The human fleet, which had been winning through audacity and precision, was suddenly losing through attrition. I watched the casualty reports come in on the station's tactical display. Each ship that went dark was 100 lives, 200 lives. People I had seen working in the corridors of the station just hours before. People who had shared their food and their tools and their ridiculous jokes with beings they had never met. Each ship that went dark was another Danny Park, another Adobe, another Kofi Mensa. The tide regrouped. It was still vast. It was still hungry. And now it knew how the humans fought. Vasquez's voice came over the communication channel. She sounded tired but steady, like a woman who had been expecting this and had already accepted it. All ships fall back to the station perimeter. Phase 2 on the station. Nobody knew what Phase 2 was. I looked at Commander Yelandari. She looked at her tactical officers. They looked at each other. Then Vasquez switched to an open channel. The widest broadcast frequency available, the same frequency the SOS had been sent on. And she spoke not to her fleet or to the station, but to everyone within range, every ship, every station, every planet, with a receiver pointed at the sky. This is Captain Raya Vasquez of the Terran Expeditionary Fleet. I am broadcasting from the Orion Corridor at the position of Station Cradle of Echoes. To every species that received the SOS and chose not to respond, I want you to hear this. We are 14 ships. We were 14. We are now 9. We have been fighting for 6 hours. We have lost good people. The hollow tide is still coming, and it will not stop with this station. It will not stop with this corridor. It will keep moving, and it will keep consuming. And one day, it will reach your worlds too. On that day, you will send your own SOS, and you will pray that someone answers. I want you to remember this moment when that day comes. I want you to remember that 1.2 million people were screaming for help, and you did nothing. And the only species that came was the one you called savage. We are still here. We are still fighting. If you have any honor left, any decency, any courage, now is the time. The savages are holding the line. Who stands with us? The broadcast ended. The communication channels were quiet. The silence lasted for an eternity that was probably only a few seconds. And in that silence, I felt the full weight of what was happening settle onto my shoulders like a physical load. This was it. This was the moment where the galaxy decided what it was, not what it claimed to be. Not the speeches and the treaties and the grand proclamations of unity and civilization. What it actually was. Underneath all of that, when the fire was at the door and someone was asking for help, the silence held and Phase 2 began. It was not what I expected. It was not a tactical maneuver, or a new weapon system, or a hidden reinforcement fleet. It was simpler and more terrible than any of those things. Vasquez ordered the 5 most heavily damaged ships, vessels that could still fly, but could no longer effectively fight, to be loaded with every remaining mining charge, every improvised device, every reactor that could be pushed to overload. Skeleton crews only volunteers. Every single crew member on those 5 ships volunteered. Vasquez had to turn people away. She had to order them off the ships, and some of them argued, and some of them begged, and one young pilot named Grace Whitfield had to be physically removed from her station on the frigate Pale Horse, because she refused to leave her crew. She stood on the station dock and watched her ship pull away without her, and she did not cry, but her hands were shaking so badly she could not hold her helmet. Danny Park was on the Stellan Maru. Of course he was. It was his ship. I was at the dock when the volunteers boarded. I did not plan to be there. I did not choose to go. My feet carried me, and my recording equipment was running, and I stood there and watched them walk past me one by one, and I could not stop them, and I could not look away. Danny saw me. He stopped, turned, and smiled. It was the same easy, warm smile he had worn while rebuilding the air recycler, the same smile he had given the Veltari child when he handed her the wrench, a smile with no bitterness in it, no resentment, no trace of the fear that must have been roaring through every nerve in his body. "Hey, archive man," he said. "Make sure you write it down." "Yeah, all of it. All of it," I said. My voice was barely a whisper. He nodded, satisfied. Then he turned and walked through the airlock. And the last thing I saw before the door closed was the cartoon dog painted on the shuttle behind him, round and fluffy and absurd. A child's drawing carried into the jaws of eternity by a man who loved his daughter more than he feared anything in the universe. The 5 ships launched. From the observation deck, I watched them go. They flew in a tight formation, the Stellan Maru at the point, heading directly into the densest concentration of the hollow tide. They were not trying to survive. They were not trying to win. They were trying to blow a hole in the swarm large enough to buy the station time. Time for the remaining fleet to mount a defense. Time for the refugees to hold on a little longer. Time for someone, anyone, to answer Vasquez's broadcast. The tide saw them coming. Thousands of machines converged on the 5 ships, swarming them from every direction. The ships fired everything they had, cutting paths through the machines. But they were not trying to destroy the swarm. They were trying to get deep enough. The first ship detonated at the edge of the tide's central mass. The explosion was a sun, a brief, perfect, blinding sun that swallowed everything around it for 1,000 meters in every direction. Machines and debris, and the ship itself, all of it consumed in a flash of white light that left after images burned into my vision. The second ship went a moment later deeper in the crew, having pushed through the gap. The first detonation created another sun, another wound in the tide. The third, the fourth, each one deeper, each one brighter, each one costing everything. The Stellan Maru was last. Danny Park was on the communications channel, calling out targeting data in a voice that did not waver, guiding his ship into the heart of the swarm with the same steady precision he had used to place mining charges in the asteroid field around him. The tide closed in, machines slamming against the hull, tearing at the armor, and the ship kept going deeper and deeper into the center of the thing that was trying to consume everything he had ever known. His last transmission was quiet, almost peaceful, he said. Biscuit would have loved this. All these stars, the Stellan Maru detonated, and the heart of the hollow tide tore open. 5 explosions, 5 brief suns, 5 wounds in the body of the swarm. And something fundamental broke. The tide did not just lose units. It lost coherence. Whatever network connected the machines, whatever ancient signal coordinated their movement and their hunger, the chain of detonations disrupted it in a way that simple destruction could not. The swarm did not just thin, it staggered. For the first time since the hollow tide had emerged from dark space, it stopped advancing on the station. We stared at the sensor displays in disbelief. The tide was still there. It was still vast, but it was confused. Its units drifting in aimless patterns, no longer moving with the unified purpose that had made it so devastating. And then, in the silence that followed the sacrifice, the communication channels lit up. Signals, dozens of them coming from every direction at once. The RIA 3rd Fleet dropped out of faster-than-light travel on the station's port side. 12 heavy cruisers and their support ships, led by an admiral named Korath, who had received Vasquez's broadcast, looked at his orders to remain in core space, and told his command staff that any officer who wished to obey those orders was free to stay behind. None of them stayed behind. An Ilwari battle group appeared on the starboard side. 7 ships that had been patrolling the border of the consortium's territory when Vasquez's broadcast reached them. Their captain, a young Ilwari female, whose name I later learned was Seelith, had mutinied against her fleet command's orders to hold position. Her crew had backed her unanimously. Veltari science vessels arrived, ships with no weapons at all, crewed by archivists and researchers who had brought scanning equipment and analytical tools because they did not know how to fight, but refused to do nothing. My own people, who had told me to save the files instead of the lives, had produced individuals who chose differently. And there were more Drenathi escort ships, Olan patrol craft, ships from species so minor and so distant that they were footnotes in the galactic records, species that had never been signatories to any accord, species that owed nothing to anyone in the Orion corridor. They came because they heard a woman's voice on the radio, asking who had any courage left, and they discovered that they did. Admiral Korath, when I spoke to him days later, told me what had made him disobey his orders. I heard a species of 4 billion stand against a swarm of 40,000, he said, and I could not remain seated. The reinforcements were not enough to win on their own, but combined with the wound that Danny Park and the other volunteers had torn in the tide, combined with the human fleet's 6 hours of relentless combat that had already destroyed thousands of machines, combined with the tide's loss of coordination, it was enough to fight. For the first time in recorded galactic history, ships from more than a dozen species formed a combined battle fleet, and they fought side by side against a common enemy. And the humans led it, not because they were the strongest or the most technologically advanced, not because they had the most ships or the best weapons. They led because they had earned the right. They had been here first. They had stood when everyone else sat. They had paid in lives for every hour of time that the station still existed, and no one, not even the proudest Reth Admiral, questioned their authority. Vasquez coordinated the battle from the Guadalcanal's command deck, which was half open to space. The hull breached, emergency barriers, the only thing between her crew and the void. She wore a pressure suit. She was wounded. A deep cut on her forehead that she had sealed with medical adhesive and ignored. Her mechanical eye flickered and sparked, its optics damaged, but she refused to leave her station. She directed the combined fleet with a clarity and decisiveness that stunned the alien commanders who had expected human leadership to be chaotic and emotional. She assigned sectors, coordinated strikes, identified weak points in the tide's broken formation, and exploited them with ruthless efficiency. She was everything the galaxy had said humans could not be. Strategic, composed, brilliant, and she was everything the galaxy had feared they were. Relentless, aggressive, and utterly unwilling to stop. The battle lasted 11 more hours. 11 hours of continuous combat, the longest sustained engagement in galactic history. Ships were lost on every side. The tide, even broken and confused, was still dangerous. Its individual units still lethal, still capable of tearing a ship apart if they caught it alone. But it could no longer coordinate. It could no longer adapt. The 5 suns that Danny Park and his fellow volunteers had ignited in its heart had burned out whatever ancient intelligence held it together. Slowly, agonizingly, the combined fleet pushed the tide back. Sector by sector, the machines were destroyed or disabled. Their movements became erratic, then sluggish, then still. One by one, the jagged angular units that had consumed entire star systems went dark, drifting in the void like dead leaves on a windless day. The last active hollow-tide unit was destroyed by a single shot from the Guadalcanal's forward battery, fired by a gunner named Owen Blake, who had been at his station for 19 consecutive hours, and whose hands, he told me later, had stopped shaking around hour 12 because his muscles had simply run out of the energy required to tremble. Then there was silence, not the tense waiting silence of the hours before the battle, a different silence, the silence that comes after a storm when the wind has spent itself, and the world is still standing, and you realize with a shock that hits you like a physical force that you are alive. The hollow tide drifted, inert finished. The combined fleet floated among the wreckage, battered and bleeding but unbroken. The cradle of echoes, damaged and scarred, was intact. 1.2 million beings were alive. I found Captain Vasquez on the bridge of the Guadalcanal. The ship was barely functional, her hull riddled with breaches, her systems failing one by one, her corridors filled with the acrid smell of burnt circuitry, and the quiet sounds of wounded crew members being carried to what remained of the medical bay. The bridge was a ruin, half the consoles dark, the main viewport cracked and holding through nothing but structural stubbornness. Vasquez sat on the floor, her back against the base of her command chair. Her pressure suit was torn at the shoulder. Her mechanical eye had gone dark entirely, a dead circle of metal in her scarred face. In her hands, she held a small data pad showing a photograph, a man with dark hair and a warm smile, kneeling next to a little girl who was holding up a crayon drawing of a round, fluffy dog. She looked up at me when I entered. Her good eye was red and exhausted, and absolutely steady. "Did you write it down?" she asked. I nodded. "All of it? All of it?" She closed her eye. A single tear tracked down her cheek, cutting a clean line through the dust and the grime. She did not wipe it away. "Good," she said. Then it meant something. I stood on the broken bridge of a broken ship and looked at the woman who had saved 1.2 million lives, and I did not have words in any language I knew to describe what I was feeling. So, I said the only thing I could think of. "It meant everything, Captain." She did not respond. She was already asleep, sitting on the floor of her ruined bridge, the photograph of a man and his daughter still glowing in her hands. In the days that followed, the galaxy changed, not slowly, not gradually, not through the careful diplomatic processes that the sovereign Concord preferred. It changed the way a bone breaks suddenly and completely, and what grew back was different from what had been there before. The dead were counted. The human fleet had lost 9 of its 14 ships, over 4,000 human lives out of a total crew complement of roughly 6,000. 2 out of every 3 humans who had answered the SOS were gone. The Allied reinforcements had lost another 2,000 from all species combined. But the number that echoed through every corner of the galaxy, the number that appeared on every news feed and diplomatic channel and public forum, was the first one. 1.2 million. 1.2 million beings who were alive because of 14 ugly ships and the savage species that flew them. The memorial services were held 3 days after the battle in the Guadalcanal's gutted hangar bay, the largest enclosed space still pressurized in the human fleet. Every species held their own ceremony. The Rife performed a silent ritual of light. Small luminous spheres released into the air to float upward like tiny stars. The Ilwari sang a haunting harmonic that resonated through the metal walls and made the air vibrate. My own people, the Veltari, read names aloud from the record. Each name spoken once and only once, committed to the eternal archive. The humans did something different. They gathered in a loose circle, officers and enlisted crew and civilians who had worked alongside them, and they told stories. They talked about the people they had lost, and they laughed and cried in equal measure. They drank something harsh and strong that burned my throat when I tried it, and they shared it freely with anyone who wanted some. They told jokes about the dead, and I was horrified, until I understood that the jokes were not mockery, they were love. They were a way of saying that these people had lived, that they had been funny and strange and real, that they were more than names on a casualty list. A young engineer told a story about Danny Park getting his hands stuck inside a reactor coupling on his first day aboard the Stellan Maru, and having to be cut free with an industrial torch. Everyone laughed. Then the engineer said, "He was the best man I ever knew," and sat down, and nobody laughed at that, and nobody needed to. Adasobi was there. She had survived, though she had not slept in 4 days, and looked like she was being held together by nothing but willpower. She held a candle, a real candle made of wax, something she had brought from Earth, and she lit it and set it on a crate in the center of the circle. "For the ones who stayed behind," she said. The candle burned for hours. I attended every memorial. I recorded every name, every story, every tear. It was my duty as an archivist. But it was more than that. It was the least I could do for people who had given everything for strangers they had never met. Strangers who had done nothing to deserve that sacrifice. Strangers whose own species had abandoned them. And while the memorials were held, the galaxy was reckoning with what it had done. The political fallout was immediate and devastating. The sovereign Concord had built its authority on the accord of mutual salvation, on the promise that civilized species stood together in times of crisis. That promise was now ash. Every being in the galaxy had watched or heard about what happened in the Orion corridor. They knew that the accord had been invoked, and every signatory had refused. They knew that the only species that had responded was the one that had been denied full membership 4 times, because it was deemed too savage for civilized company. The Rith government collapsed within a month. The political leadership that had ordered the fleet to withdraw faced a wave of public outrage so fierce that several senior officials fled their offices. Admiral Korath, who had defied those orders and brought the Third Fleet to the battle, became the most celebrated figure in Rife history. When the new government formed, they offered him the position of Supreme Commander. He declined. He said that the position should be offered to a human, and he was only partly joking. The Ilwari Consortium faced mass protests from its own citizens. Thousands of Ilwari, furious at their government's refusal to help, organized unauthorized aid convoys and sent them to the Orion Corridor in open defiance of corporate directives. Several consortium board members resigned. The captain, who had mutinied, Sealith, was court-martialed and then immediately pardoned when the tribunal judges received messages from 3 billion Ilwari citizens demanding her release. The Valari arrives. It updated the records, but this time, the update was personal. I was summoned to the Grand Archive on our homeworld, the vast subterranean library where the history of the galaxy is stored in crystal matrices that will outlast the stars. I was asked to present my account. I was asked to revise the official entry on humanity. The old entry was 4 lines long. Category 12, savage, low threat, emotional, aggressive, fragile, not suited for participation. I deleted every word. The new entry took me 3 months to write. It runs to 47 pages. I will not recite it here, but I will tell you how it begins. It begins with the words, "When the galaxy abandoned the cradle of echoes, the humans came." The Sovereign Concord was restructured from the ground up. The old leadership, the diplomats and bureaucrats who had voted to abandon the corridor were removed. New representatives were elected, including many who had defied their governments to join the battle. And in the first session of the new Galactic Assembly, a motion was put forward to grant humanity full membership. Not provisional, not conditional, full membership with a permanent seat on the Assembly Council. Not at the margins, not in the back rows where minor species were traditionally placed, but at the center. The motion passed unanimously. Even the species that had refused the SOS voted yes. They had no choice. The weight of shame is a force as real as gravity, and it was pressing down on every government that had turned away. 6 months after the battle, I was invited to address the new Galactic Assembly. It was the first time a Kari archivist had spoken before a full session of the galactic government, and I will admit, terrified. Not of the audience, not of the politics. I was terrified that I would not be able to say what needed to be said, that my words would be too small for the thing I had witnessed. I stood at the speaking platform, a small figure before the assembled representatives of 100 species, and I activated the holographic display behind me. It showed the old Veltari archive entry for humanity, 4 lines, Category 12, savage. I read it aloud, and the silence in the chamber was total. Then I closed the file, deactivated the display, and spoke from memory. I watched them come for us. I said, in ships held together with welding wire and stubbornness. I watched a man paint a cartoon on his shuttle for his daughter, knowing he would not survive the day. I watched a medic hold the hand of a dying alien she had never met, and sing him into whatever waits beyond. I watched a Marine teach alien children a clapping game in a shelter, 12 hours before the end of the world. I watched 14 ships charge 40,000 because a stranger asked for help, and they could not bear the sound of someone asking, and no one answering. I paused. The chamber was so quiet I could hear my own heart's beating. We called them savages, I said. We called them savages because they feel too much, fight too hard, love too fiercely. We called them savages because they frightened us. Not with their weapons, but with their refusal to be reasonable. They heard the same mathematics we heard. They knew the odds were impossible. Every civilized species in this galaxy looked at those odds and made the rational decision. The humans looked at the same odds and made the right one. We called them savages because we did not have the courage to be what they are. And when the fire came, the savages were the only ones who walked toward it. I looked at the assembly, at the hundreds of faces watching me, and I said, the thing that I had carried inside me for 6 months, the thing that had been burning in my chest since the moment Danny Park handed a wrench to a child and walked into the dark. They are not what we thought they were. They are what we forgot how to be. I stepped down from the platform. The chamber was silent for a long time, and then, starting from a single-ray delegate in the front row and spreading outward like a wave, the assembly rose to its feet. Not for me, for them. For the 4,000 humans who would never hear the applause, and for the species that had sent them. I did not stay for the ceremonies. I did not stay for the diplomatic receptions, or the formal resolutions, or the speeches by politicians, who had found their courage 6 months too late. I had one more thing to do, and it was more important than any of that. I traveled to Earth. It was my first time on a human world, and it was nothing like I expected. I expected something rough and primitive, a planet of warriors and fighters, all sharp edges and loud voices. What I found was a world of staggering beauty and contradictions. Green hills and gray cities, quiet forests and roaring highways, ancient buildings and gleaming towers. A planet that had been bruised and battered by its own inhabitants, and had somehow emerged more vibrant for the scars. I traveled to a city called Lagos, a sprawling, chaotic, magnificent place on the western coast of a continent the humans called Africa. The city was loud and colorful, and alive in a way that reminded me of the human cruise on the Cradle of Echoes. That same restless, joyful, slightly chaotic energy that seemed to fill every space they occupied. I found a small house in a neighborhood where children played in the street, and music drifted from open windows. A woman answered the door, tall and dark-skinned with Danny Park's warm eyes. His wife, Amara. She knew who I was. Vasquez had told her I was coming. She invited me inside. The house was small and bright and full of photographs. Danny in his engineering uniform. Danny holding a baby. Danny and Amara on their wedding day. Danny and a little girl with braided hair and a gap to smile, building something out of colored blocks on a kitchen table. The little girl was in the backyard. She was 7 years old, and she was sitting in the grass with a crayon and a piece of paper drawing a round, fluffy dog with floppy ears. I had brought something with me. I had carried it across 400 light-years through diplomatic channels and customs checkpoints, and 3 different species of transport ship. The wrench. The simple metal wrench that Danny had given to the Veltari child on the Cradle of Echo. The child's family had given it to me when they heard where I was going, and they had asked me to pass it along with a message. The message was in Tari, but it translated simply enough. Tell his daughter that her father's kindness is remembered. I knelt in the grass next to Lily Park. She looked up at me with curiosity, not fear. She had never seen a Veltari before. A tall, 4-armed being, with translucent blue skin and enormous dark eyes, but she was her father's daughter. And her first instinct was not to be afraid, it was to be interested. "Are you the archive man?" she asked. Mom said the archive man was coming. "I am the archive man." I said, "Dad talked about you." She said, "He said you were very tall, and you wrote everything down." He was right, I said on both counts. I held out the wrench. She took it in her small hands and looked at it, turning it over, studying the weight and the shape of it. "Your father gave this to a little girl on a space station, very far from here." I said he taught her how to use it. He told her that every good engineer needs her own wrench. "The little girl asked me to bring it to you, so that you would know that your father was kind even when he was very far from home." Lily looked at the wrench for a long time. Then she looked at me, and her eyes, Di's eyes, were bright and steady. Dad was the best at fixing things. She said he could fix anything. Yes, I said he could. She showed me her drawing of Biscuit. She told me about his adventures, how he could fly, and how he protected the house from monsters, and how he liked to eat pancakes for breakfast. She asked me if I wanted to stay for dinner. Amara was making jollof rice, and there was plenty. I stayed. I sat at a kitchen table on a planet I had never visited, in a house that belonged to a man I had known for less than 2 days, eating food I had never tasted, and I felt something I had never felt before in my long and careful life. I felt like I belonged. Not because the house was mine, or the family was mine, or the planet was mine, but because I had been invited, because these people, these extraordinary, impossible, savage, beautiful people, had looked at a stranger and opened their door. That is what humans do. That is what they have always done. They open doors. They answer calls. They fly across the darkness toward the sound of someone in pain, and they do not stop to calculate whether it is worth the cost. They crash through the mathematics of survival with the blunt, magnificent force of beings who have decided that some things matter more than living. I have archived the rise and fall of empires. I have recorded the birth of stars and the death of worlds. I have chronicled 11,000 years of galactic history, the treaties and the wars, the discoveries and the disasters, the slow, careful march of civilization across the void. But the most important entry I will ever make in the records of the Veltari archive is this. When the galaxy abandoned us, the humans came. Not because it was logical, not because it was safe, not because we deserved it. They came because someone was screaming, and humans cannot stand the sound of unanswered pain. The old archive called them savages. The new one calls them something else. It calls them family. I finished my rice. Lily asked me to draw biscuit with her. I picked up a crayon in each of my 4 hands, and I tried. I am still learning how to draw dogs, but I am getting better. Danny's daughter is a patient teacher just like her father, and the wrench sits on her windowsill catching the logo sunlight. Proof that kindness travels farther than light and lasts longer than stars.